Friends, can you hear me? Good. So glad to have you all with us here in person as well as online. I'm going to take my watch out so I keep track of time. Our intention is to speak, mostly for me to listen, ask a few prompting questions for about 40 minutes, and then field questions that will come to us both from online and here in person. And someone will be playing the role of Oprah running around with a mic in the audience. So let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you for the gift of your presence with us and the gift of that remarkable poem by Natalie Diaz. I think we'll be mulling over that for quite some time, those of us who are here to hear that. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
So my first question is this. I'll read it to keep myself from rambling. Could you tell us how you came to be interested in eco-theology broadly and water issues in particular? This is just not the sort of thing that happens in divinity schools and seminaries, and you have taken a very unusual route. I don't know anyone else in theological studies who's taken quite this route. So how did that happen?
Well, how are we doing on sound? As you can tell by my fumbling, the headband headset and I are not cooperating, so I'm just going to hold it. Thank you, John, and thanks again to everyone for joining the conversation. Yes, mine is not a normal route to thinking about environmental ethics and pairing water and theology. I had never thought of it in quite that way until you said it at dinner a few nights ago in a more offhanded way, but you're right, I don't know anyone else who really works on water and theology and ethics and tries to, in an interdisciplinary way, think with, read with, move with fresh waters as an ethical substance, informed by traditions of Christian theological thinking and other cultural, religious multiplicities, ways of understanding and relating to water. Sometimes these narratives only make sense in retrospect, yes. Right? I mean, my students say to me a lot, Professor, can you explain how you came to do what you did? Because it just seems like you've got it all together and it makes sense. And so how do I know what my path should be? And I say, let me disabuse you of the idea that this was all planned out in advance, right? All of our becomings, professional and personal, are a combination of geographic, social, intellectual, and economic accident, as well as intention. And in my case, growing up in the arid United States West, I had always paid attention to how fresh waters flowed, who controlled them, to what purposes. So being born in the Central Valley of California, one of my early memories was going up in a helicopter, actually, with my father, who was an airline pilot, and seeing the ways that the center pivot irrigation systems, I didn't know to call them that at the time, I was 6 or younger, the ways that they made some fields bright green and verdant, and others desiccated, fallow, and flat. And so, when you're a kid, you don't realize that your experience is not obvious to everyone else, is not universalizable, and as we age and develop theories of mind and experience other people in the world, we come to understand that there are lots of places and ways of understanding. And so in college, I studied human biology. I became really interested in biomedical ethics and questions about valuing life, especially at the end of life. So I worked a lot on end-of-life care kind of questions. And it wasn't really until I moved to the East Coast, and my then spouse was doing a graduate degree, that I realized that fresh water seems like an obvious thing to all of us, because it's so daily, it's so quotidian, it's so omnipresent in many ways. And yet it is deeply, deeply culturally mediated, whether that's by value systems and the stories we tell about it, or by the institutions that govern it, the kinds of infrastructures that facilitate its flows. And so I started thinking, well, this is a lot more interesting than some of my coursework right now, if I may be so blunt. Bless all of my professors from whom I have learned a great deal. And so I went to my advisor, Margaret Farley, and I said, Margaret, this might sound crazy, but here's my idea. And this would have been 2006, 2007. And she said, Christy, I don't understand what you're talking about, but I trust you. So go and figure out how to make your case, and then do it. Wonderful advisor to be able to say, I don't yet know what you're talking about. Please make it clearer, and also, I trust you are seeing something. And so that project became my dissertation, became part of my first book, became the justification for me being hired as a professor of theology, science, and ethics. Some of you may know that in the history of science and theology conversations, a lot of those conversations have taken the shape of, is quantum physics compatible with divine action? Or what kind of implications does Darwinian thought have on notions of the human being and human uniqueness and the imago Dei? And how can churches and theologies respond? Cool questions. I love Darwin. Awesome. But when I was in the interview process at Fordham, I said, look, if you want someone to talk about the quantum physics divine action thing, I can teach that. But what I'm really interested in is thinking about how the ecological sciences are part of our growing understanding as humans of what it means to be embodied and in relation in this world. And the embodied aspect is the theological anthropology of it. The in relation, for me, is the ethics of it. And so that's what I do.
Wonderful. There's so much more I could ask about that, but let's move to the questions that I think many of us will have in our hearts and minds. Having read some of your work, I know you care about the life of the church and believe that the church has an important role to play in addressing issues of the climate crisis. Could you say something about what kinds of things you envision the church to be doing? What can we do? And why have you invested so much of your time in making a case, besides to get tenure, besides that very practical reason, why these issues should be at the forefront of the minds of congregations like this one?
That's a lovely question, and I was reflecting earlier how moved I was by the petitionary prayers, and the framing of just what a task of discernment it is to know what is ours to take on and take responsibility for, what is ours to let go of a little bit, and where hubris or fear might come in those dynamics. I thought that was a really moving articulation, so thank you for that. And I feel like something is true for churches and houses of worship, communities of worship, with regard to climate crises more generally. I tend not to refer to fresh water in the singular. I tend to refer to it in the plural, fresh waters, because of, while there is a universality, there's also a radical particularity of place and of social relations. Water theorists call those hydrosocial relations. And I think that something similar is going on with climate crises, right? There are these overarching dynamics that kind of structure our understanding of anthropogenic climate changes and the effects, often mediated through water. But it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Certainly there are things that can be done at levels of scale pertaining to diminishing fossil fuel combustion and that sort of thing, but how it actually looks at different levels of scale is a real question, and what meaningful action in response looks like is also a real question. I am getting there, I promise.
No hurry.
So when when I talk with students and we explore the very real phenomena of eco-anxiety, of knowing that things are looming, knowing that the scale of the problems is so far beyond individual control, or efficacy in some cases, the question then becomes, well, what can we do at different levels of scale, and why and how might that matter? Now, I'm just gonna be real honest. I am a pretty cheerful social person, but sometimes I'm a real downer, like at Thanksgiving dinner when climate crises come up, or when there's single-serving disposable plastic water bottles. My daughter, at a very young age, we were at a party, and she saw a flat of them, and she goes, Mama would not like that. I think what churches have the potential to do is to help us all in our individual lives, in our social lives, in our professional lives, to discern what actions we are distinctly capable of and why those matter in value systems that are external to and sometimes challenging of standard assumptions of the way things function in policy, in political economy, and whatnot. What I read from Natalie Diaz, the great Mojave poet, the first water is the body, the first body is the water, the non-metaphoric nature of this. This is a very different imagining than, say, water as an economic commodity. There are also forms of community, I think, that churches can envision, and it seems from what I've learned, like you at St. John the Divine do abundantly with regard to food justice and with regard to unhoused folks and community. And I think these are ways of knowing and ways of relating that matter enormously. And as I say to my students, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for these problems, but the invitation to you is to figure out where your particular, and this is an idea that I'm drawing from Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, a wonderful science and climate change communicator. It's to figure out where your knowledge and your skills and your talents in one circle on a tripartite Venn diagram intersect with the very real needs of the world and the community and the earth. And then the third circle, what brings you joy and energy and fulfillment and connection? And at the center of that Venn diagram is the thing each of us can do individually and on various scales. And it just seems to me that houses of worship are distinctly poised to help with that discernment collectively going forward.
But in order to do that, there's a lot we have to learn.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you would say. I mean, in part, that's because this is a bookish congregation. We have book groups. We love to read. We're a geeky, nerdy congregation in significant measure.
My people.
Yes, very much so. So it seems to me that you might say we need to acquire a measure of ecological literacy and then some eco-theology. How do we, I'm slightly hyperventilating because that's a lot to say. And so how do we go about the work of learning? What do we need to learn in order to do that task that you just so well articulated?
Oh, goodness.
I know. It's a huge question, but it's a question that will let you talk. So.
Okay, so I have two answers immediately. One is from my esteemed colleague at Pacific Lutheran School of Theology, the Dr. Cynthia Mo-Labida, who some of your congregation may have some familiarity with.
Yes.
She's written some wonderful things about climate coloniality and forms of action that can make a difference. But this actually has nothing to do with that. She and I were on a panel on Zoom last fall, and we got to talking about, I don't even know how we got on this topic, but it was something of a version of a question that I have asked so many speakers over time. The first time I asked it to someone was Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, and I said, how do you sustain hope in such a deluge of dire data? DDD. And What Cynthia said in the conversation last fall was, my garden. She said, I must spend time in my garden or I will lose my mind. This is me paraphrasing at this point. And immediately I just felt this wave of familiarity because it is, and I have chills saying it, because it is, while I have a much smaller garden because I live in New York, the truth of tangible relationships with growing things and loving and living humans or plants or whatever you're in relationship with makes such a difference. So a way to ground amidst the discovery and the deluge. The second thing I'll say is that I have a really complicated relationship to the news and even to scientific journals and certainly to journalistic climate change writing because a lot of it has this kind of apocalyptic pulse to it. And that can be a very exhausting place to reside. And so I tend to go about my research in personal life and also professionally on the basis of questions. And I think one way to do this that is helpful in, say, a congregational setting, given that we all have finitude, both psychological and temporal, is to say, okay, well, where does our water come from? And what is the shape and the type of the aquifer that we're drawing from? And how does that relate to the surface waters that flow? And what's the history of that? I know from Terry, where'd you go, Terry? That some of us, some of us in this room have been reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And John had been telling a story on Thursday about the invitation and the challenge of Robin Wall Kimmerer's line, become indigenous to place. So how to do that without recolonizing? I think what she means, and you can expand on this more fully, is come to know the flows of the places and begin there, and then ask the questions that move out and connect, as they certainly will, with all these other global dynamics, political, economic realities, and so forth.
Great. So one of the features of your work, in fact, there's a whole chapter in your book, Just Water. Easy to remember. I like the play.
I love puns.
Yes, it's a great pun, Just Water. Do get the book. We like to plug people.
Oh, thank you. Get the 2018 version.
Yeah. So in that book, one of the features that comes through is that you don't really think, and this is an important principle, I think, for you, that we should talk about water apart from the lives of people who are often the most affected by the questions of water justice. And specifically, I mean indigenous peoples who are having to fight for access to waters on their own land, and then control over pipelines and the like. So tell us about sort of how you proceed with this business of attending to water, but attending also to the people in whose care these waters are present. I know in particular that you sort of cheered Papa Francis in Laudato Si for saying that we need to learn from indigenous wisdom, but there was also some very, very important cautionary notes sprinkled throughout that chapter about how we do this work of learning from and working with indigenous communities. So,
Thank you for your generous and thoughtful reading of the book. And you're right. I am very aware, as a person who's grown up with all kinds of white educational privilege, that it's easy for me and others like me to stand and say, well, here's water, and here's what the water crisis is, and here's how we solve it. Something that I'm keenly aware of now, at the age of 43, as a tenured professor at an institution in New York City, is that one of the things I can do in my work, both teaching, writing, and other contexts, is to model what it is to listen and to integrate and to lift up wisdom that has been overrun or occluded or just fully flattened out by dams or other forms of what Indigenous scholar and water protector Kelsey Leonard calls hydrocolonialism. And one of the marvelous things about fresh waters is that if I were to say to all of us in this room, have a big whiteboard up here, like a good professor, and say, okay, what is water? There would be some overlapping responses. Some of us who, think in terms of chemistry or molecular structures might say, ooh, H2O, polar tetrahedral, amazing capability. Yes. And there would be a whole onslaught of other responses, and all of those would be true. So one of the deep, deep wisdoms of indigenous populations, of folks who have borne the brunt of water's pollutions or burdens, as at Flint, Michigan, for example, one of the deep things that those in positions of power have to learn is, what else does water carry? What else do we collectively need to know about fresh water that is not being told in these dominant narratives? And the dominant narratives are often, not always, conditioned by forms of hydraulic technology and science, by political demand and expediency, and by economic patterns of valuation, financialization, and property regimes. So yes, Pope Francis. I'm delighted that in his recent statements, whether an encyclical or his sermons, he's giving a lot of street cred to indigenous value systems. I'm wary of how that looks because he's still referring to ecological value within a monotheistic, pretty explicitly Christian theocentric kind of frame. And I think Bill McKibben put it best when, in a review article he wrote in the New York Review of Books in August 2015, he said, this is really interesting because the question remains, can an institution which first set out to universalize the world truly learn from and integrate other perspectives? And I think that remains an open question.
Well, I'm just going to make it harder for us for a moment, and most especially you. But
well, good, because this has been super easy so far.
Well, Pope Francis just left, and
Yes.
called attention again to the very deep wounds that have been inflicted, particularly, North America in general, with respect to our relationship both with the land but also the caretakers of the land. It feels like the church no longer has credibility to speak with any moral authority on just about anything. I hate to put it that bluntly, but we have to name things that are true. And for a lot of people, this is the last place they're going to go, looking for anything new or healing given our history. So I like everything you're saying to us about learning from, learning to know place, becoming indigenous. But how do we overcome the crisis of credibility afflicting the church before we can be a prophetic voice about anything? Or is that before the wrong word? Is it, maybe that isn't a question of temporality, we have to get our house in order and then we have to talk about water issues. Do you have a sense on, I know you've thought about this, so you must have some help to give us on how to engage these issues in the midst of this crisis of credibility.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. That's such an important question. And one that I don't want to undermine by my prior jocularity on the gravity of prior topics. My first thought is that I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because you, my friend, you are the Reverend Doctor. Oh. I'm just the doctor. And I think that for me, I think what I can most ably say to this is that apologies without action or apologies that presume an easy restitution that may, again, reinscribe wounds and patterns of abuse is no apology whatsoever. And so, while the symbolism matters, and certainly no pope has done anything like this before, so good on him, I think it's how things continue to change structurally that matter most. Who has been harmed? Who is entitled to care and reparations? And where do they find safety and love and healing of generational traumas? And folks who are in those situations get to be the ones to articulate it, you know? Right. And it may not be within the walls of Christian community or churches. It may not be. And that may be I think for the most part it won't be. And that's part of the transformation of church. And the humility of standing in this ecclesial moment is to recognize that no matter how powerful individual relations to ecclesiology or church or, in my case, professor institutional relations, we don't know the future. And the best we can do is stand with integrity in the space where we are and trust other people to articulate what it is they need. And obviously that's a sentiment that is deep in me that applies to many situations beyond residential school abuse and Catholic Church sex abuse in the United States. It stuns me still how few people working in theological ethics in particular, and Catholic theological ethics within that, are willing to say the institution has really wronged people by not condemning these kinds of behaviors and by facilitating systems that allow these behaviors to perpetuate. And it's in almost every talk I give and things I write, I say, this crisis of credibility is entirely real and entirely warranted. And so I don't know what that looks like going forward, but I feel like really responsible leadership recognizes that aporia. And I've been really heartened and touched by the way that in your bulletin, in the prayers, in Reverend McCollum's invocations, that kind of sensibility surfaces here. But I want to know what you think before you ask me another question.
Yeah, no, this is a fundamental question for me because I do work, as you know, in interreligious dialogue. Mm-hmm. And it's a fraught proposition to go seeking conversations with people you've wounded. Mm. And if you don't face up to that fact, there's no possibility of authentic conversation. And so I often speak about the hospitality of receiving and of reinterpreting the Great Commission, right? Which go out into the world and proclaim the gospel. And we've been doing that for 2,000 years. I propose that for the next 2,000, we shut up and listen.
Oh, I like that.
So Gandhi very explicitly, it's quite something to read his talks to missionaries. He says repeatedly, time and again, you come to this land to give us many good things. And that is well and good. But I miss in you a desire for receiving. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that
lands.
It does. Yeah, it's powerful words. Mm-hmm. To have Gandhi have to say that to Christian missionaries, it really smacks you across the face, Yeah. And so that call is what I'm trying to foreground. His argument that it's time for the Christian tradition to receive. And I think that means something like, in the Zen tradition, going out into the marketplace with open hands. Mm. Not just to give, not just to be of help, but also to learn from people who have much to teach us. And until we think that we actually have something to learn, we have actually nothing to give. And I think that's partly what Robin Wall Kimmerer is talking about when she says becoming indigenous to place. It's about reorienting the entire infrastructure of our thinking, including our do-gooding, to think that perhaps our do-gooding needs to be also tuned to the key of receptivity and learning and correction before we can be of any genuine help. But I don't know that you can temporalize matters spiritual. I think you have to do many things at once. You have to do the repentance, you have to do the learning, and you have to do the helping, such as it is ours to give. There's no logic of a straight line temporality possible in spiritual life, I think. First you do this, then you do this, because you're always screwing up everything all at once in your life anyway.
Yeah.
And so there's something about the liturgical sensibility of, fessing up every Sunday. Oh, boy, I screwed that up. The whole week, a litany of many, many mistakes. And then you repent. You remember again that you're part of the body, that you're not alone in this, and you go out into the world seeking to love and serve the Lord.
Yeah.
So I think something like that simultaneity, which is part of the logic of the gospel and of liturgy, is probably something that I would commend. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Thank you for sharing. I could listen to you talk about these things for a long time.
Well, hopefully in New York, maybe.
Yeah, and I'm resonating too with your sense of liturgical and spiritual time being decidedly nonlinear, and laughing. I'm thinking of the early Thomas Merton, who was so convinced that it was regimented and linear, and then of course the later Thomas Merton who gets into Zen and realizes many more things. But this idea of weekly repentance, I think that it is a real danger that there's so much to be aware of in terms of complicity when you're someone living in the so-called first or industrialized world, in my case embodied as a white woman with, as I mentioned, a lot of educational privilege. There can be a tendency towards just, I'm mired in it, a lot of self-flagellation. And as I've come to understand it, this, what you call repentance, what I might call reflection, is less about flagellation, self-flagellation, and more about observing and learning, and then integrating and metabolizing that and saying, okay, I see a little better now. Okay, here we go again. Try again. Yeah. It's one of the things that as a professor I'm so grateful for, is that in a different liturgical way, on a weekly basis, on a semesterly basis, on a yearly basis, these rhythms renew, and we revise syllabi, and we meet with new groups of students, and we make horrible gaffes, and there are moments of pain and delight in the classroom, and still we try. And there's a kind of parallelism there.
Yes. My friend and colleague Cornel West likes to routinely quote Samuel Beckett, try, fail, try again, fail better.
Nice.
And I like that fail better from Beckett. Yeah. So it sounds better when Cornell says it.
Well, most things do.
Most is, indeed. Now, I want to wind down my questions so we can turn to questions from the congregation. But I want to really get, this sounds silly to say, I was going to say closer to the bone, but I think we've been pretty close to the bone already. Those of us who follow ecological issues closely are, I think, facing our own emotional crises. I know from reading that climate scientists have to grapple with real despair and hopelessness. And in the general public, therapists report that growing numbers of clients are coming to therapy speaking about eco-anxiety and real depression around climate issues. Now, this is I don't think it's made it into the DSM yet, but it is a thing that's increasingly happening. I have to imagine you have to face this daily because you read and work and live this almost 24/7. So both from your own personal life and also as a counsel to the congregation, what is the wisdom you have to offer us? How do we genuinely feel these things? Because I don't think there's any good in bypassing them. But not let the enormity of it all just paralyze us and keep us from, just being functional human beings. It's not just carry on with our work, but, taken very seriously, these crises have the capacity to incapacitate us.
Yeah.
So I'd be grateful for any wisdom you have to offer the community on how to navigate these issues. Just another small question.
Christy's top 10 tips for living in a climate catastrophe.
Yes.
No problem. So obviously, first of all, I use macabre humor. That's one. But I take your question very seriously.
Yeah.
It is, in a sort of like very dire meta way, while I was writing my dissertation, I had this quote from the BBC from an article 2005, one of the early ones about the water crisis. And the quote remains, "The facts about the worsening global water crisis are sure to induce mental meltdown."
Oh.
So I had this above my desk, and I've puzzled for a lot of years over why I did that. Because it's not like this is inspiring, right? I can't really be in touch with my motivations from that time, but I like to think of it as a recognition of the reality that we cannot take it all in and hope to be present in our own lives. And for someone whose life and work are immersed in learning, communicating, debating knowledge, that might be a weird thing to say. But whether it's with regard to information, or whether it's with regard to trauma, or whether it's with regard to certain kinds of relationships, our bodies, of which our minds are part, can only bear so much. And so I think that all of us have to learn what our thresholds are. And those thresholds may change over time. They may shift based on the mode of knowledge intake. Last week I was at an amazing environmental humanities institute learning from an elder in the Penobscot Nation up in the coast of Maine. And hearing the information from her with her handouts as we're sitting in a circle was a very different experience than seeing it come across a news feed or Twitter. Because I could engage, I could ask questions. We were all having embodied responses to it. For me, I think also finding your way in to the questions, distinct to who you are, what your passions are, what your concerns are, is another part of it. So on the one hand, no one can take it all in. Number two, know your thresholds and your mode of delivery. But then number three, find your way in to the issues and the questions, because there is no view from nowhere. And once we start to recognize that, we absolve ourselves a little bit of feeling like we have to be responsible for it all. Because individually, we just can't be. So those are things with regard to the data and the realities. Another mantra I say to myself a lot is, and my students too, is look, we may be screwed, totally possible, but let's do something. Not blindly, not irreverently, but let's do something. And again, what that something looks like depends on who you are. Cynthia Molabita, grow a garden, absolutely. And also run a climate justice institute. Others of my students have gone on to become environmental lawyers and work on particular nodes of questions that need attention. Others go into finance and they want to work against the financialization of freshwater resources. So all those kinds of things. But then maybe the last and most important thing is to follow delight. This is a mantra that increasingly I have for living anyway, but we are here with the human capacities we have for whatever reasons you want to ascribe that to, but one of the capacities is for delight. And it can be an act of hubris, I think, and of pride to immerse ourselves so much in what is horrible and difficult that we forget to live ebullient, joyful, together lives. So whatever makes you say yes, dancing, singing karaoke, other kinds of things, do it. Do it, because that's also part of how the magic of connection with other humans happens. And who knows, you may end up seeing possibilities that you didn't before. So delight, even if things are really falling apart, which they are. And for a lot of communities, many indigenous communities, they have been for millennia, right? This is not the first apocalyptic rodeo, as scholars like Kyle Powys-White and many other indigenous scholars point out. So find delight and give yourself some space for it. It matters. It's part of being human too.
Thank you, Christy. Now, questions from our online and in-person audience. I think Karen or Vanessa will be carrying a mic to you so that your questions are also recorded. And by the way, we have to have your permission.
Yes, you have my permission to record. No problem. And broadcast, whatever.
You can
use my image, but not if I'm like making a weird face.
Okay.
Yeah.
Questions?
Feel free to put up your hand and Vanessa will come find you.
Yeah. Or stories, or comments, or points of connection, things that are surfacing that you don't really know how to phrase. All of this is welcome.
One of the things I really do in my classroom is to increase their tolerance for silence.
Oh, yes.
Because, people do need time to generate really important and existentially significant questions. So we're fine waiting a few moments. But we do want your questions. Of course, there's always the soft thread of asking directly, volunteering people. But here.
I don't really have a question, but more of an observation. Over the past number of years, in the news, in Maclean's magazine, even people just talking, there's a really big concern about our Canadian waters being bought up by private sources. And I really don't know how far that has gone along or even how to research that. So maybe my question is how much do you know about that? And you said something about financial ecologists. Maybe they're working in that realm? I don't know.
Thank you so much for that. That's a great question. Speaking of learning one's place as a starting point, this phenomenon of corporations, wealthy individuals, or nations buying up swaths of land in order to have rights to the water below is a global phenomenon. And I'm not familiar with the degree to which it's happening in British Columbia, but it is something that is very live as an ethical issue. And it's linked to, but also separate from, questions of extraction of water, use of water, and then pollution of water by mining industries, fossil fuel and other. Because all of that, in its various ways, renders waters inaccessible and unusable for human or ecosystem health. So I would say the places to look are, there's a really great water news website that does a lot of focused issues on things like water grabs, land and water grabs, which is what you're talking about. That's what it goes by. And this research institute is called Circle of Blue. They're a global water news source, Circle of Blue. They're on Twitter, they've got a website, they do all sorts of projects, they're great. So I highly recommend them. There's also, at the University of Victoria, something called the Polis Water Center, which looks at water relations and politics in British Columbia in particular, including Vancouver Island. And so while I can't off the top of my head think of whether they have any projects going on about this, they would be one kind of gateway for looking at some of the research questions surrounding this and surrounding water justice. Thank you for asking that.
Other questions? John? Oh.
Hi, thanks, Christine. Good to see you again. I think my question is about the question of indigenizing your relationship to the land. And it's about kind of ways of applying your argument to specific regions or bioregions. So, a lot of the folks we have come in to give John Albert Hall lectures are from out east, where churches have deep roots and still a lot of social capital in the public arena. And I wonder if the sort of general reflections you're offering work as well in Cascadia as they might work in New York, Boston, Toronto, and other places where there is a greater gravitas to institutional Christianity. As with when folks come from Oxford and Cambridge, similarly, there is just this sense that people are going to pay attention to these people with the collars, and I more so than I think there might be here.
Yeah.
And so my question would be, are your observations and your kind of ways of thinking about the place of eco-theology in its confrontation with this terrible crisis we're all facing? Is it spatialized or regionalized? Because it strikes me that one would speak in a different register here than in New York, Boston, Kingston, Quebec City, Montreal. And
Great
John
question.
can respond to that too.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. Also, Paul, I didn't recognize you with a mask on.
Yeah.
Hi, great to see you. Oh my goodness. It's so lovely to see folks whom I've only had the pleasure of meeting in 2 dimensions on Zoom. It's so lovely to have an embodied proximity. The answer is yes. I remember moving from California to Connecticut and being stunned by the clout that institutional churches and much more traditional forms of liturgy and theological and ethical communication than I was used to. I was stunned by the clout that those had. It was an enormous cultural difference. Also, there were many more Dunkin' Donuts, which was a totally new phenomenon to me. And this is something that I really ponder because I'm in a department of theology at a Jesuit university. My PhD is in religious studies. I work in the environmental humanities. Water is my jam, and I don't really feel like I have a sense of the degree to which exposition of traditional theological teachings or expansion of them makes any or much difference. I think it can when people in positions of leadership feel a resonance. But that's a very live question for me. And what I have been really stunned by with the publication of my book, Just Water, is how it has resonated across geographic areas. And I don't think that's because of the chapter in which I say, okay, here are the 8 ways that Catholic social teaching has figured ecological concerns, especially water. I think it's because of narratives of value and relation that waters mediate, some of which have a theological inflection. This is probably a good time to say that I'm really an accidental theologian. I tend to be pretty apophatic in my statements of faith, and So it still always makes me laugh that I'm in a department of theology and, an eco-theologian, but at the same time, yes, these are the imaginations, the cultural imaginations, the embodied realities, the rituals, the communities that we have, and they take different shapes in different places. But I also think how waters signify and how people understand themselves in relation really varies geographically and spatially. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on religious naturalisms or anything like that. Maybe there's a book coming out that speaks to these things. Paul Ricoeur has a line from one of his books that truth makes a nonviolent appeal. And I feel like potentialities for action and rightness are not always the clear ethical or political lines of sight that we think they are in retrospect. Sometimes there are things that make a nonviolent appeal that feel true, that call out to be responded to, and then we begin to ask the questions of what would be the best way to respond. And so to the degree that theological languages and communities intersect with that, I think yes. For further research and conversation. What do you think about this, John?
You keep doing that. You're the star here.
I'm a professor and I'm good at what I do.
Yes, you are. I think it's intriguing that you had the intuition to start with a poem. A poem that speaks a powerful sacred vocabulary, but not the vocabulary of ecclesiology. I think that's right. I think part of what I'm articulating when I'm talking about hospitality of receiving is acquiring a listening ear to other poetic imaginations. And so I write and talk a lot about theopoetry. That part of what we have to do in this moment is to invoke different symbolic repertoires and registers, and learn to speak again into intimacy with the world. I don't care what vocabulary does that. We need it, right? We have fallen into a kind of desiccated relation with the natural world. And even that phrase, the natural world, suggests that somehow we're out of it and we're having a relation with something else that's the natural world, right? You can't get over that kind of bifurcation, that kind of stilted imagination, apart from those who can speak us into new ways of imagining, new poetries. So my intuition is that one of the things that ecclesial institutions can do is perhaps be a place that can nurture and listen and give voice to other people whose ways of imagining the world are not quite as bifurcating as ours are at the moment. So that would be a starter answer from me on that question.
Thank you. I love that, and the integration with your work to date is really lovely as well. Thank you for the reminder of theopoetry. And
well, you did that with the poem, so yeah. Richard, did you have a hand up there? Yeah. Oh, okay, and John here too.
And we have one from online too.
Okay, well, we'll deal with these three questions and then wind down.
Thank you.
Good.
you're good.
I'd like to ask you about dialogue with politicians, because my understanding of the prophetic tradition is that prophets were communicators, whether they did that from the rooftops or whether they did it quietly, in some sort of inner sanctum talking to power. I find part of the problem with moving from the theological to the political is we leave it at the theological, and we feel very good about that. but how do you get the message through to the people that are making the decisions in the communities in which we live? And even in democracies, I think the standard response of politicians, even those who've been ecologists and environmentalists in a previous life, is, I've got to think in terms of the next 4 years. What is it we can do and what we can't do. We've been, of course, investing heavily in the issue which you raise, but there's a complete blindness to the reality that we're talking about a slide that we're on, right? Which could have very dire effects, if not in 5 years, then in 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years. And that doesn't get discussed publicly by politicians. They may feel it, they may recognize it. So what is the role of A, an academic, and B, an academic interested in theology, in talking to these people? Because presumably that's part of what it's about.
Thank you. I hear the challenge and the invitation. Yes, I mean, a professor of theology, science, and ethics is not the first place that politicians turn when they want to think about environmental policy. But I do think that, as you indicated, or as I heard you indicating, might be two different things, something that professors with job security have is the freedom to say uncomfortable things that do not bow to the logic of election cycles or fiscal quarters. And I think that's very important. I think universities, at best, can be proofs of concept of ways to live. I mean, I'm talking here very materially, even within our own infrastructure, thinking about climate adaptation, fresh water use, and all these kinds of things. But I also think there is a responsibility of folks like me who work on topics like water to say, okay, here's this economic way of doing it, here's this political pattern, here's why these are problems, and here are some things that we could do about it. I try to do that to some degree in my book, especially in chapters on agriculture, for example, and climate change. And a lot of the take-homes that you give depends on the audience to which you're speaking. But there are some things that seem to me to be clear as day that may or may not be politically popular. The big one in the US is to start growing climate-appropriate crops in various bioregions. And by climate appropriate, I mean, especially with attention to soil and water quality. And as part of that, to stop the massive agricultural subsidies for corn and soy and so forth that have led to massive monoculture and farm centralization and so forth, and to really rethink the life of farms in the nation. Now, that's no easy thing, and it sounds, one danger of someone in my position is that someone can say, well, you're literally in an ivory-colored tower 12 stories above Manhattan. Like, really, it is a white concrete block. And that's true. So what I've tried to do to that is, I haven't done any really in the pandemic, but public-facing articles on CNN and a couple educational platforms like TED-Ed about freshwater scarcity. And in conversation with other forms of value. And then I've got an article that I've been sending around to some folks on request that really delves deeply into ecological economics and points out the problems with standard economic theory when it comes to a substance like fresh water. And as with the book, as with teaching, I don't always know where these things will land. And I'm not a policy expert, so I'm not great at crafting policy. But I'm happy to offer what I'm discerning and learning as I can. And then also, and this is just a funny thing about the moment we live in, I'm moderately active on Twitter, and so one thing I try to do is amplify perspectives or policies that I think have some real clout and possibility to them. But it is a, well, perhaps less so than it was a few years ago, but it is a dire time to be in the US and in different ways, I think, in Canada, in terms of environmental policy and social policies too.
Richard, Kate, and then online. And then we'll wind down.
Thanks. First of all, I just want to say thank you tremendously for being here and doing this for us today. I don't really have a question, but it's a comment. I've been in the therapy field for 37 or so years, working mostly with adults, but along the way, I've also worked in several after-school cares and been a guest speaker in schools. And I just can't help thinking that children may be one of the most important audiences.
Yes.
And I've experienced that children get stuff, and they often get stuff that adults don't, and there may be an important place to start to actually shape some changes in the world we live in. They may be an untapped resource, no pun intended. So just want to plant that seed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work in therapy and in education for these years. I mean, side note, personal note, one of the great things about New York City is that everyone's in therapy to deal with living in New York City. So highest recommendation. Who doesn't benefit from 45 minutes of talking about yourself in relation to all these things and being like, oh, look, there's a pattern. So yes to that. In addition, total yes to kids. Kids see connections. Kids construct possible worlds. Kids are not attached until we tell them to be, explicitly or implicitly. Kids are not attached to particular forms of ideology or outcome. And so I 100% agree with you. And one thing that has been really cool to see is the ways in which water education and thinking about ecological systems education and environmental justice are increasingly part of science curriculums, often in more progressive areas and districts. But you're totally right. And so the TED Ed videos I made that I was mentioning just a few minutes ago are actually used in a lot of elementary and middle schools to teach, like, 8 through 13-year-olds about water scarcity, water cycles, and raise questions about water ethics instead of just being like, well, this is the water cycle, and but to point out human emplacement in that. What you're saying too also harkens back to a deep memory that I haven't thought of in years, which is that in 2008, summer of 2008, something that only a first-time parent would do, my then spouse and I took our 6-month-old daughter on a research trip to the West Bank and Israel and Jordan, as one does. And it was really amazing in many ways and also deeply exhausting in others, because that's a lot of juggling. But I was in Jordan for 36 hours and was there on the gracious invitation of Friends of the Earth Middle East, which does a lot of important water work and diplomacy in the region. And in addition to the leaders of Friends of the Earth Middle East, we also met with the then Minister of Water in Jordan, which, as you may imagine, is a tricky place, given its aridity, given the surge of refugees, given the contested area near which the kingdom lies. So being a water minister in that milieu is really tricky. And one of the points of conversation that everyone around the table agreed on was that the memories of all the adults gathered were of the Jordan River, of the Jordan River Valley, were of a very different river. And that their childhood, the sense of possibility of what this region was and how they inhabited it, and the sense of connectivity had kind of given way to, I guess, a realism about what the situation was at that moment. And while there were tons of disagreements on what ways forward should be as and among adults, what everyone agreed on was that kids needed to be brought into the conversation and educated, not just in a, here's the history and here's the problem and this and this and this, not in a straight framework kind of way, but in a much more capacious educational way. And then the meeting ended, and I actually don't know whether that was pursued as a cross-border kind of initiative, but I think it points to many truths at once in what you're saying. So thank you for your comment.
Kate, and then the online question.
Thank you. You talked about dominant narrative and then later about finding threshold. And I'm struck also by the BBC quote that you had above your desk and the deconstruction of self and systems in the phrase mental meltdown.
Yeah.
We're in a time now where we are having our thresholds passed on a daily basis. Things and events that we thought would never occur are constantly happening. So in a way, we're all having our meltdown moments and passing our thresholds. And Richard pointed to the wisdom of children who are often living with these deconstruction and rebuilding moments. So my question is, living in a dominant narrative, within the dominant narrative, how do we begin to recognize it and disentangle ourselves from it? What was your aha moment?
Ooh, wow. What a multi-dimensional question. Thank you, Kate.
She tends to do that.
Yeah, wow. My first aha moment around working with water was that the embodied spatial geographic wisdom of having grown up in California and Colorado was a form of knowledge that deserved to be listened to. And that while I by no means had the full story or authority of that I needed to follow it, even though it made, well, as I mentioned earlier, it made absolutely no sense to my advisor or to Yale or to any of these established institutions of learning. That was related to the aha moment that I just found my coursework very boring. And I thought, this is, surely I'm missing something. And then the aha was, oh, right, it's been right in front of me all along. A second kind of aha moment is ongoing. I mean, I am constantly aware of how little I know, of how, especially doing interdisciplinary work, I know a lot, but oh my gosh, there's so much to learn in this world and listen to, and so many perspectives. And so, whether it's with a neologism like the hydrosocial cycle, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, or a term like hydrocolonialism, something that I also mentioned previously, or the way that an author frames a particular issue, those, oh, right, oh, that's a really useful way, like I see, that helps me. Those keep happening, and I'm deeply grateful. I mean, it gives me chills as I'm saying it. I'm deeply grateful to be in a career where I can pursue and listen to and begin to metabolize insights that are not of my of my creation. At present, I teach, as I mentioned, in a theology department in a Jesuit university on the East Coast, and as Paul indicated, there are certain kinds of attachments to theological, ecclesial institutions and structures. And so one of the things I'm quite honestly grappling with right now is how to do the work I do with integrity in an institution that is committed to much more isolated forms of knowledge production and theology meaning a particular kind of thing. And I don't always know how that looks, but I think that for me, a lot of it is putting resources of established traditions or ecclesial moral statements in conversation with really big issues and really important thinkers, so Natalie Diaz and others. And so I think there is in all of my work a strong deconstructive element, as you mentioned, a willingness to, I've described it in some places with the notion that Jeff Stout, who's a theorist and scholar at Princeton, has used of moral bricolage, right? So like the art form, you take colors and pieces and textures and put them together to create something that reveals, that makes sense. And in that, there needs to be a non-attachment to final forms, to the ongoingness of the process.
And if the online person is still online, they get the last word.
Thank you. If so.
Sorry, that was loud. It's actually one that came in on the Facebook live stream.
Okay.
And one part of the question I already answered, because the first question was, what's the name of your book? And I gave them a link.
Thank you.
Just Water, in case you missed that. And the other, the follow-up question are, could you recommend any other readings? And what can we do as individuals to make the most impact for positive change? Which seem like good questions to, as we're wrapping up.
Yes. Oh, I am happy to give you a bibliography or a syllabus. That's the sweet spot. Okay, so let's take that one first, because that's a little bit easier. One of my favorite writers on water is a woman named Cynthia Barnett, a science journalist and environmental journalist. Man, journalists are so smart. Oof. They learn so much on the fly and integrate it so beautifully. So she wrote a book in 2011 called Blue Revolution. That is a great book because she, like many journalists, takes a situated approach, looks at problems in a given area, articulates how the intersection of political and infrastructural and ethical language is happening, and then says, okay, here are some things we might do. So that's pretty cool. She looks at impervious and pervious surfaces in Seattle. She looks at recycled water in Singapore. Really, really great book and author, and she's written a bunch on water as well, and has a new book on seashells, if you're interested in that. Another book I'm reading at present, actually, and by a Victoria author, Erica Geiss, is called Water Always Wins, and it was just published this year by Chicago University Press. I'm partway through, and it's really, really good. So I have actually had some of these aha moments in the last couple days as I've been reading her book. And some of the aha moments have had to do with questions of aquifer refill and how that might look. So I recommend her work. You can also find the work of folks like these just by Googling their names. Erica Geiss is G-I-E-S is her last name. Cynthia Barnett, B-A-R-N-E-T-T. Let's see. Yeah, I think those are the two I would want to start with in terms of water and what else to read.
And then a charging mission, sending us forth
Yes.
in good church form.
Well, I do also want to say that there are a couple op-eds by some experts, scholars, and indigenous advocates whose work I really respect and have learned from. And one is a woman whose name I mentioned before. Her name is Kelsey Leonard, L-E-O-N-A-R-D. She's Shinnecock from the Shinnecock Nation on what is now Long Island. Another is Tara Hauska, H-O-U-S-K-A. She is a lawyer and works on water and land sovereignty issues. She has a TED Talk that's very easily accessible and really great. And so I'd recommend both of them for sure.
And a final word to charge us out with? No pressure.
I'm going to end with a line from a poem. Is it a poem? Might be prose. Anyway, it's by Kathleen Norris, the spiritual writer.
Mm-hmm.
I read it, early in grad school, and it stuck with me so much that I painted it on the side of my dresser, because why not? And it's this. A spark is struck, an event inscribed with a message. This is important. Pay attention. And a poet scatters a few words like seeds in a notebook. Pay attention to what sparks, how it may become a seed, and where you may plant it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for the lovely, lovely conversation and the long duration of your sitting here today.
Thanks for being with us.
My great pleasure.